All right, let's start this. This is just going to be a ramble. When I was a kid, I read it was a YA series called Tunnels, and I made it to like book 4 out of 6, and then I kind of just stopped reading it. And it wasn't because I didn't like it. It was just because, like, I guess I caught up to book 4. And since the series is UK from the United Kingdom in origins, and it's not as popular as Harry Potter, I guess I kind of just dropped off. Like, I know that my mother had to get it off the black market because the fourth book, at least, because yeah, it just wasn't selling in the United States as well. Either way, I decided to come back to it. I decided to try rereading it just for fun. And this is something new. I almost exclusively read adult fiction now. I decided to reread this because I remember it being pretty brutal, pretty dark. And of course, it is YA. You got the teenagers for protagonists, and yes, it's accompanied by this certain brutality. It's not just like characters dying, though certainly characters die, but it's also the manner in which they die. You know, it's not like, oh, I'm gonna have this last stand and save my friends from death. It's not usually death like that. Like, of course, there's specific examples, but a lot of the deaths the circumstances surrounding it are actually kind of disturbing. So yeah, I was kind of excited to go into this, even if it is YA. And I read all 6, and yeah, overall, I actually really enjoyed it. Obviously, it's not perfect. There's some things I would tweak, especially with the last 2 entries, books 5 and 6. But I was not disappointed. I thought it was pretty good. So, in the beginning, it's like the first 3 books especially. It starts out with the characters, and no spoilers by the way, it starts out with the characters tunneling down below the surface of the earth, and they end up finding a civilization down there. And there's the civilization, then there's also a ruling class called the Styx, and they're just basically oppressors. They're completely immoral, vicious race of humanoid beings. And that basically kicks off this adventure where they go to what's called the colony. That's the first place. And then, of course, book 2 is called Deeper. You know, the first entry is Tunnels, then it's Deeper. But they go, well, deeper. And then Free Fall, keeping things vague. They just fall into a free fall, and things just proceed from there. In those first 3 books especially, they have like a certain atmosphere, right? They're just down below the surface of the earth. It's very dark. It's very bleary. They're traveling in an incredibly hostile environment. And that overall atmosphere was just so engrossing. It's just perfect. I loved it. And again, it was accompanied by this certain brutality as they're going through all this hostile territory. And they're just completely out of their element, the main characters are. And then, of course, the story kind of takes a turn where the Styx, they have plans with regards to the outer world, and they're also completely in control of the inner world, too. So the focus begins to change, especially by the 4th book, where there's some revelations down below, but then they also start to shift the focus outward. And, of course, books 5 and 6, they begin to sharply deviate from, well, the first 4, especially the first 3 books. And I'm kind of mixed about how to describe it, actually. Because on one hand, it feels like a sharp deviation, right? In terms of tone, because they take a more action-oriented rather than adventure-based approach. But also in terms of like the actual content. When I first read the 5th book, I got the impression that they were introducing elements that they did not plan for. And while that's certainly possible, and even likely, they also did a fairly good job introducing these elements in a way that kind of fits what they've previously established. There's a bunch of seeds that were kind of planted, and they built off of them in interesting ways. And when I first read book 5, I was actually really mixed on it, because I thought that the new introduction kind of messed up some of the previous plot lines, especially the motivations for a certain character. But of course, I thought about it a bit more, and I began to realize that it's actually a bit more complicated than that, kind of. And book 6 kind of changed it up, and you understand that character's motivations a bit more. They kind of threw in an offhanded comment at the very least. And it didn't change things up as much as I would have liked. However, I think they did a fairly good job making sense of the introduction and all of that. And of course, book 6 is where things just go completely off the rails in terms of, not quality, but in terms of, again, the content, everything that happens. And overall, I really like the ending of the series entire. the ending is either incredibly bleak or incredibly funny and incredibly interesting potential, right? It's one of those kind of endings where you can interpret it either way. And I know I was looking through reviews and people were like lamenting at it and stuff like that. But I interpret it as actually kind of showing that there's potential. It shows that there very well could be potential in terms of, say, happiness or continuing the life of the main character without it being entirely bleak. But in a very interesting way, which is pretty dark, but still, it's kind of a mixture of the two, which I found to be really interesting. Yeah, the ending, it honestly made me laugh. Not in a way that was like at it, not in a way that was degrading the story, but yeah, I found it funny. It was very interesting. So yeah, that's the general idea, and of course I can critique certain aspects of it. I think the last two entries were a bit too rushed. They shifted away from an adventure-based story, which tends to be slower, and more toward a more action-based story. So they're much faster paced. I think this is tied to something else, which is how some of the tension from those original books were kind of brushed over in these last two entries, right? Since it's adventure, there's certain areas that you have to travel through that were very tense and very evocative in those first three entries. But then as these final final three entries begin to crop up, they're just like zipping back and forth between these two spaces, and there's basically no tension anymore. And I'm not saying that it completely undermines the original entries, because obviously the characters have more experience, and also just in general, the circumstances by which they travel back and forth are completely different. But in terms of atmosphere, I thought they could avoid losing that ominous, tense feeling as you're traveling through the spaces. But again, they're just brushing over these things in the space of paragraph, or maybe even just a sentence, and just for the sake of fast-paced action. And I thought they could have tweaked that a bit. And also, I saw one review of the final entry. Again, no spoilers, but they criticized it for having, the MacGuffin, and having a certain character operating under like a sixth sense that kind of drove the plot forward, right? Where because of who they are, they know something without really being able to articulate it, and they have to follow through on this implicit knowledge in order to drive the plot forward. And they mentioned that the story could have been much better, much more interesting if they actually had specific ideas in mind and had to strategize and move forward. And I actually kind of agree with that. But it's also balanced out by the fact that it's not like strategy was non-existent in the storyline. There was actually multiple plot lines in the story, where it's not like it was one specific plot line that had this MacGuffin effect, while every other aspect did have the strategic value. Another thing worth mentioning is in the final two entries, I thought they could have depicted some of the action with a bit more detail. They could have had higher stakes. And I don't mean like, oh no, trillions are going to die as a result of this. Not like that kind of stakes, but like the way it's written. In terms of execution, I thought the story could have been more competently written so that the characters are more embroiled in the threat. And the way it was written, I didn't think they captured that as well as they could have. And I'll admit that the way they did write it does add a kind of tension in its own right. I can't really get into specifics, but they might have like a certain conflict that goes too easy, right? Which kind of builds up tension because you're like, really? That kind of implies that they've been misled, right? But I think you could balance that, instead of having it happen so easily that everything's just brushed over. Instead, they could have a bit of a threat and then realize afterwards that, oh yeah, that still kind of was too easy though. Either way, I think the story as a whole, I really enjoyed it for what it was. Again, it's YA, so don't go in there expecting like R. Scott Baker levels of threat and brutality, or A Song of Ice and Fire. It's not some insane adult fiction, but it still has this incredibly brutal approach to storytelling with character deaths in kind of cynical ways that kind of catch you off guard. I think that more or less covers it. I have now released both volumes of The Paths We Have Taken, which is the first arc in the Broken Reality. This is my grim, dark, epic horror fantasy series. It takes the political intrigue of A Song of Ice and Fire, the abrasive characterization of Abercrombie, the long-term storytelling of One Piece, and the philosophical horror of the Second Apocalypse to explore the human capacity for cruelty.
Check it out if you are interested.